We're back with some political analysis. Jamelle Bouie is the chief political correspondent for Slate magazine. He's also a CBS News political analyst. Ramesh Ponnuru is the senior editor of the National Review. Nancy Cordes covers the Democrats for us here at CBS. And Ron Brownstein is an editorial director at Atlantic Media. Our new Battleground Tracker poll shows a 2-point bounce for Donald Trump in the 11 battleground states following his convention. The change comes almost entirely from a handful of those Republican voters who went into the convention as undecideds, not from a conversion of voters who were previously with Clinton. Clinton's support remains the same despite so much of the convention's focus on her. Ron, I want to start with you. What did Donald Trump get out of his convention? Who did he pick up? Who did he appeal to? And
I think those results make a lot of sense to those of us who were there. I think what they did best at the convention was burnish the image of him as a strong leader who gets things done. I think that was pretty effective over the course of the week. But the tone and the message was ominous. It was confrontational. It was divisive. If you look at polling, John, that's actually what he was talking about in that final speech, kind of the echo of Richard Nixon's Sirens in the Night, pretty much reflects the view of Trump voters who are more likely to fear that they're going to be the victims of violent crime or terrorism, more likely to say America was better 50 years ago. But if you were a moderate, suburban, white-collar white voter who were worried that Donald Trump was too divisive going in, there was nothing in that made you less worried, and probably things that made you more worried. And if you look at polling today, the most conspicuous weakness for Donald Trump is that he is significantly underperforming relative to earlier Republicans among college-educated white suburban voters, the kind of voters, by the way, that Tim Kaine is most precisely aimed at.
Nancy, there was a lot of talk of Hillary Clinton at this convention, and there were a lot of attacks. Was there a central theme that emerged, or was it just a blast of anti-Clinton?
I think the central theme was that she's a criminal. I mean, this is what you heard again and again from the stage. I heard as many chants of lock her up as I heard of USA, USA. I mean, that was clearly what got a huge response in the room. The question, as Ron points out, is does that get a huge response in the country? You could see it going either way. You could see those independent white suburban voters saying, you know, that goes too far. This woman has not been indicted of anything. And you could see others, you know, hearing that message over and over again and having it feed into a view that many people already have, that perhaps she's not as honest as she could be, and that may burnish the case.
The Quicken Loans Arena did sometimes have the feel of a coliseum a little bit more than of an arena. The thing that strikes me is, you know, people talk about how pessimistic Trump's speech was, but he's personally, of course, very optimistic. And it was not the speech of somebody who thinks he's an underdog. It was the speech of somebody who thinks he's structurally ahead. There was no attempt to pivot, to moderate, to expand the message, to bring in new people. It was just an amplification of the existing message. They think they're winning this thing. Now, the polls, I think, don't suggest that. If you are 1 point up after your convention and before the other party's convention, I think that means that structurally you're behind, but evidently they don't.
Did we learn anything new, Jamelle, about Donald Trump?
I don't think we learned much of anything new. I do think we got a bit of clarification about what is driving at least a good chunk of Trump's support. The things that struck me over the course of the convention, especially on Monday night and on Thursday night, were the extremely heated denunciations of illegal immigrants, of radical Islam. And the extent to which those messages are the ones that got people excited. People were not excited about a new policy proposal. People were not excited about when, during his speech, Trump mentioned trying to help people in inner cities. That didn't get very much applause, but we don't want them here got, people stomp the floor. And so I think, if anything, this convention has, for me at least, clarified that what we are looking at is an ethno-nationalist movement. It is a campaign explicitly centered on the idea that certain categories of people that you can identify by sight are threatening to Americans.
You know, I was on CNN yesterday with a Trump supporter who, complained about Tim Kaine talking in Spanish and said, I didn't need a translator for anything at the Republican convention. And then Ann Coulter tweeted this morning, interesting to hear Fareed Zakaria with his heavy Indian accent talk about what we Americans should be doing. In polling in June, 77% of Trump supporters in the PRRI poll with Brookings said they are bothered when they hear immigrants talking in other languages than English. I agree. I think, it was striking to me that the section on trade was greeted with almost silence in his acceptance speech. And what you've got really, I think, here is an election that's going to divide the country along cultural structural lines between a coalition of transformation, which is the Democratic coalition, essentially diverse America and the portions of white America who are most comfortable with that. They tend to be urban, they tend to be younger, they tend to be secular, and a coalition of restoration, where Trump is running really well, is in non-urban areas with blue-collar white America, with more deeply religious, who are in a lot of different ways feel that the country is evolving away from what they believe the core of America is. And that, I think, more than income, is going to be the lines that we're going to see in this election.
And by the way, there are a lot of Republican leaders who don't agree with the approach that you've just outlined. And that's why you heard so much Hillary Clinton talk from the podium, because they couldn't really get behind that message that Donald Trump is putting out there. So they had to talk instead about her.
And it was extraordinary to hear Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader who delivered the Senate to Republicans, be booed. And Paul Ryan, when he mentioned that he'd been vice president in 2012, it was very tepid applause to that. And Trump never mentioned that he was going to work with Congress. Ramesh, Ted Cruz came on stage, said, vote your conscience. He was booed off the stage. Now that this is sorted out a few days, did this matter? Is this just about Ted Cruz? Does this have any larger point about unity?
Well, I think it does matter. It certainly matters for the future of Senator Cruz, who I should note is an old friend of mine. But I think it also matters for the Trump campaign. And it's not so much that Senator Cruz made a blow against Republican unity, although he did. It's that Trump has compounded that blow by continuing to obsess about it. He has said more remarkable things about Ted Cruz in an attack on him than about Hillary Clinton since his convention ended. That's really an amazing thing. He is broadcasting his lack of self-control and his pettiness in a way that is unusual for a major party nominee.
Jamelle, we should switch to the Democrats or we're going to run out. So Tim Kaine is picked, counter-programming yesterday to the Republican convention, wasn't it?
Right. Not just in terms of sort of Tim Kaine is a, the best you can say, he's a very professional kind of guy, right? Very down the line, very no surprises with Tim Kaine. But also his sort of coming out speech was very positive and very optimistic and very much sort of a statement, I think, of purpose for the Clinton campaign, that we are going to run a campaign focused on unity, focused on sort of showcasing the best of the country and not trying to scare people. I will say that there was some unhappiness on the left with the Kaine choice, in part because of Kaine's stance on abortion. He's personally anti-abortion. As governor of Virginia, supported some minor measures that were favored by pro-life Virginians, but otherwise is a pro-choice politician.
And the Clinton campaign pushed back at that immediately because they knew that was going to be the criticism. And so they put out basically his report card from all of these progressive groups like Planned Parenthood and the Human Rights Campaign saying, look, he's got a 100% voting record with these people. I think the biggest news to come out of that speech yesterday was that Tim Kaine is not boring. He did a masterful job of lowering expectations, but that was one of the strongest speeches that we have seen on the campaign trail. And I think, he's got this smile on his face all the time. That's sort of what he's known for in the Senate. He's a pretty upbeat guy. And it kind of lent an air of sunniness to a campaign that has really been missing it.
If you're a Sanders supporter, it's been like a Bernie Sanders supporter hardcore. It's been a tough 72 hours. I mean, Kaine is probably closer to the DLC side. The WikiLeaks showing the Democratic National Committee moving, it probably didn't matter that much, but it was kind of awkward and inappropriate. But Kaine himself, I thought, did a very good job in two respects. First, I think he humanizes himself very well. Talking about his son in the military, I have a son in the military. I can, say how unspeakably proud you are, and I thought that really, brought that out. But even more, I thought he braided his personal story into the reality of the modern Democratic coalition. Tied himself to the civil rights movement with his wife's role in integrating Virginia schools. Tied himself to the Hispanic community by speaking in Spanish. And the last point, he is urban. He is the first relatively big city mayor on a national ticket since 1968. And he is a candidate who in 2012 ran even better than Obama in the big suburban areas of Virginia. That is the future of the Democratic Party, and that is what he represents.
Ramesh, they're trying to make this a non-change ticket. The Republicans are. Donald Trump is saying, these are two politicians.
Yeah, that's right. The Republicans want it to be a referendum on the status quo, and I think the Democrats want it to be a referendum on burn it down. And people may not like the status quo, but maybe they'll be even more against burning it down. I think that selecting Kaine, who, Hillary Clinton was asked about his reputation as being boring, and she said, it's one of the things I love about him. And I think that's a revealing remark, because you want a safe, steady pair of hands if the campaign you're running is going to be about the recklessness, impulsiveness, and unfitness for office of your opponent.
I want to add one more thing about Kaine, and this is a point of contrast that he presents with Donald Trump. Kaine's first sort of big thing in his career was fighting housing discrimination. He won one of the largest settlements against redlining in American history. And this comes as Donald Trump's first appearance in the national scene, at least in major newspapers, was as a defendant in a housing discrimination suit, being sued for blocking black tenants from his buildings. And so I think here you see a sly kind of not just setting up a dispositional and temperamental contrast, but sort of very much, this is what we have stood for and this is what he has stood for kind of contrast.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you. We'll figure out what's happening after the Democratic convention happens. We'll be back in a moment.